Evening class, welcome to our presentation on the October-November 2021 exam paper. Next presentation will be next Wednesday, same time, which will be presented by Dr. Pilkington. Just a reminder, those of you who want to use a second monitor in the exam, IRIS only allows one monitor by default, but it can be set up to accept two monitors. So can you please remind Dr. Pilkington to arrange to have it set up for two monitors? I have requested him to do it, but best you remind him next week for those of you who want to use a second monitor. But IRIS can definitely be set up to allow multiple monitors. Just to respond to this last question in the chat, has anyone received communication for the module exam guidelines and using IRIS and that? Okay, I didn't know that was an issue. I've got a link where you can check what the situation is for every module. I will add it to the links in the discussion forum in the COS3711 exam topic. So you can I'll do that after the meeting. You can have a look at that link and find out what the situation is for basically all modules at Unisa. Then next thing, Dr. Pilkington sent out an email early, excuse me, early today. Excuse me, earlier today about a marking of assignment 3. The only part he's not going to mark is the standalone server part. Everything else will be marked in full. So it's just that one little bit that's not going to be marked. Unfortunately, with such a big class, we have several hundred students. It takes a lot of time to mark assignments. And he really wants to get marking out before the exam. So yeah, to save a bit of time, he's just leaving out that standalone server part. So the rest of it will be marked in full. Then something else that's coming up is there's been some notifications from Unisa that you have to add a picture of yourself in my modules. There's a post on Facebook about it, and also it was mentioned in one of the exam prep webinars. Now, as far as I know, that only applies to the Moodle invigilation and not to IRIS or to the Invigilator app. But unfortunately, Unisa haven't made that very clear. So as far as I know, it doesn't affect you in any way because IRIS has its own way of doing things. Then the other exam-related questions that I haven't got answers for yet is the issue of load shedding and what to do if you are affected by load shedding. As far as I know, you have to apply for a special exam similar to an AgriTat. And then the other thing is data for exams. Unisa haven't issued any communication yet. But I have heard a rumor that it's due to be done on Friday and data will be issued to whatever number you've got set up on my Unisa. It's probably not going to help most of you in any way because you have to use a laptop for IRIS, and that data only helps if you're using a mobile device. If you're using a router with a SIM card, you could maybe put that number in there and get some free data. But then to get to the point, anybody, please, who's going to attend one of those webinars in the next few days, please ask, it's a guy by the name of Richard Wright who's presenting them. Please ask him the following questions. Clarify the issue of uploading a picture to my modules. Is that only for Moodle invigilation or for IRIS and the Invigilator app as well? What to do if you're affected by load shedding, and what's the situation with data? So anyone who does attend, please ask those questions and post the answers on my Unisa, but I'm not getting much response through official Unisa channels. So if you do get that info, it would help, I think, quite a few students. Then the E-tutor survey, I've already posted a message about it, but unfortunately COS3711 was left out of the list of modules. There is an announcement on my Unisa where you can access that survey. The survey is being conducted by an external service provider. So nobody at Unisa has access to any of your submissions, and only the summarized results will be passed on to Unisa. So if you want to do a survey for any of your other modules, you can still go to that link that I've posted in the discussion forum in my Unisa. Any questions so far? No, okay. And just before we get going with the exam paper, I would like to have a look at something slightly different. Okay. Can somebody confirm, can you see this listing? I'm not sure how you pronounce this, Tyob or Tyobi.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, right. This is an index of the popularity of programming languages. It's a very comprehensive index. It gets updated regularly. And if you look at the website, you'll find they give quite detailed information about how it's prepared, but it is quite in-depth and well-researched survey, and it's quite interesting to see the popularity of various programming languages. As you can see, the flavor of the month of the year is Python. That is the most popular language at present, and it has been hanging around near the top quite a lot recently. We'll see that when I scroll down a bit. And something I find very interesting is the original C language, and I emphasize the original C language. It's also been sitting in the top 3 sort of forever, but the second most popular language is still the original C and not C++. So that's quite interesting. And then third in the list is Java. And then our favorite language, C++, is fourth, and C# comes in fifth. So you'll see the basically 4 of the top 5 are all C-based languages, the so-called curly bracket languages. So if you have a knowledge of C or C++, you're quite well placed. It's often said that if you know C++ well, it should only take you about 2 weeks to convert to the other curly bracket languages like Java and C# and probably PHP as well. So the point I'm trying to make here, we often get queries about using C++ and Qt. I just wanted to show you this so you can see where C++ fits in. Now, I just want to emphasize in this course, we are not really teaching C++ and Qt as such. They are merely tools that are used to present the various concepts such as reflection, models and views, threading and design patterns, and so on. So please understand that this course is not specifically about C++ or Qt. Those are just tools that we use. It's the actual concepts that are taught that are important. And then just for interest, I'd like to look down this list a bit. There's a few things interesting here. You notice that JavaScript comes in at number 7. JavaScript actually more or less dropped out of this list a while ago when TypeScript, Microsoft's TypeScript became popular, but now it's completely reversed and JavaScript has shot back up again and TypeScript has sort of dropped out. And those of you who did COS3621 assembly language rates in the top 10. So maybe that course was sort of worthwhile. Things like SQL and SQL and PHP, which is one of my favorites, comes in at number 10. Then another one that I find very interesting, Objective-C, has shot up the lists again. It's made a very big jump up. You see its previous position was 24, it's now 11. Those of you who use Apple products might find this more interesting, but when Apple brought in Swift, Objective-C basically dropped out of sight totally, and Swift shot up. But now you can see, now I have no idea why this is the case, but Objective-C has shot up the list, and you notice down to 16, Swift is dropping down. Swift was brought in to replace Objective-C, but now I see that Objective-C has overtaken Swift quite strongly. So that's quite a strange one, and I don't know what the answer is. Then you'll see other things in this list, something like Fortran, which one would have thought was ancient history, is make its way up the list here in 15th place. That's also quite a surprise. And if you look through this list, you'll see quite a few interesting things. There's a lot of information here. Yeah, you can see how each of the languages has been progressing over time. For instance, you see Java is in the green. It's been sitting around pretty much near the top a lot of the time. And basically, you can track how the various languages have been progressing in popularity over time. And then there's a list of the less popular ones. Another interesting one here, COBOL, which one would have thought is ancient history. You know, you'll often find posts on the internet about COBOL actually being the language that is still in most common use. They say that there are still more lines of COBOL in everyday use than any other language. I don't know how true that is, or in fact, how anyone would actually measure it. But apparently it's because COBOL is so widely used by the American Department of Defense and all the federal government agencies thing in the banking sector. And there's just so much code in use that it's just far too expensive and time consuming to replace it. It just keeps on doing what it's supposed to do, and it's just not economically viable to replace it. So that's a bit of a surprise that COBOL is still so widely used. And then you'll find all the other, see TypeScript way down the list. It was at one stage quite popular and way above JavaScript. Then you'll see here's a list of the next 50 languages. You might recognize the odd name in amongst here. Ladder logics used for programming machinery and robots and like. I don't recognize too many others here. Yeah, there's not too many well-known ones. And then the other interesting here, the very long-term history, you'll see how the various languages have progressed over time. See, Python came into significance around 1997, and then has just steadily progressed up to the top. The C has been basically in the top 2 basically forever. JavaScript also started around 1997 and climbed very quickly up to the top. And then the whole reason I'm showing you this, C++ has basically hung around very steadily in the top 2, 3, 4 places. So C++ is one of the long-lasting languages and is still a very popular language. And in fact, according to this index, it's more popular than C#, which is of course a much newer language. And then you can see how the other languages here. So I think this is quite an interesting index. And if you've got a bit of time and you're interested in how your favorite languages are doing, you can have a look at this index. It's quite interesting. Then moving on to Qt, if you look at this Wikipedia article, you will find a reasonably interesting list of applications that use Qt. And if you look through here, you'll recognize some names, Adobe or Adobe, I'm not sure how you pronounce that, ADB's products, Calibre, something I use from time to time, EagleCAD, there's a list there, Google Earth, so that's quite a big app using Qt. What else is there? Scribus is a small little desktop app. TeamViewer is quite a popular sharing app. And then Telegram, which I'm sure quite a lot of you know about. Wireshark. So there are quite a few well-known apps being developed with Qt. And then if you look at the list of organizations using Qt, You'll see some big names here: AMD, BMW, Electronic Arts, and DreamWorks. Apparently, a lot of their graphics for their movies are done using apps written in Qt. Lucasfilm, Star Wars, and the like is done with Qt. Even Microsoft uses Qt. Samsung, Siemens, Tesla, pretty much up-to-date companies. Walt Disney Studios. So there's a lot of big names that use Qt, so it is in quite a wide use. You can have a look at that. Then the other thing I wanted to say, or following on what I was saying, is that Qt and C++ are merely tools. The concepts that we learn, and I'll show you some more detail now, are equally applicable in other languages such as C# and Java. And if we just have a look at them, okay, this is the one I had in here. Network. If you Google networking in C#, you will find a whole lot of information about networking using C#. So you can just Google that for yourself. And then if we go to Java, you'll find there's a lot of information available about networking using the same concepts, TCP and so on, in Java. So it's equally relevant to that. And then if we look at the other aspects that we've looked at, REF, LEC, reflection, Java. See, reflection is just equally applicable to Java, same kind of definition that we've used using Qt. Again, there's lots of information about reflection. And if we do the same for C#, you'll find there's, again, lots of information about reflection in C#. Now, I'm not going to go through all the aspects that we covered in class, but let's just look at another one. If you look at model and view, Java, you'll find a lot of information about design patterns and MVC, MVC model views, and how to implement that in Java. And then if you look at C#, you'll find models and views and so on, creating a view, managing data with view model, and what is view model in MVC and so on. And if you do the same thing with XML and threads and the various design patterns, you'll find similar kinds of results. So all of the concepts that we've covered this year are all equally applicable in languages such as Java and C#. So I just want you to basically get the idea that what we've been doing is not Qt specific, it is not C++ specific. There are in fact general concepts that you can use equally as well in any of the other popular programming languages. The top 4 or 5 or 6 languages all have these concepts in common, and they are equally applicable in all of them. Are there any? Sorry, I'm just looking at the questions. Okay, I see there's a comment here about data, October the 3rd. Okay, that's an update. Comment about modern phones will allow us to support for hotspot. Yes, of course. Should have thought ahead about that one. So yes, you could use your data with your laptop. Walter Dolphy is still around. Yes, Object Pascal, it's very popular. It's actually quite a good language to learn in. And Tristan learned some Lua. Okay, well, that one I couldn't tell you a thing about other than the name. Telegram as well uses Qt C++. Yes, Tristan, indeed it does. Sorry, someone had their hand up. Do you want to ask a question?
So is the exam open book or not?
Yes, it is open book. Gee, we've been saying this all year. We went through this at length last week. Have a look at the recording of last week's class. We dealt with that in detail. You can refer to any source you like, but you must submit your own work. And you have to use IRIS for the exam, and that's to make sure that you write the exam and you don't get outside assistance. Other than that, you can look at any source, but do not copy and paste anything from a source. What you submit must be your own work. Okay, can someone just confirm the screen sharing that you can see the header for the past paper? Unfortunately, with MS Teams, I can't see what you can see.
Yeah, we can see it.
I
Okay.
can see the past paper for 2021.
All right. Is there any further discussion on any of the Qt or C++ stuff that we talked about? There's a question, can exam answers be in pseudocode and not Qt? Okay, Qt is not a language. No, if you ask to write code, it has to be C++ and using the appropriate Qt classes, no pseudocode. Charles' question, if you're using Linux, but you want to compile a Qt code to get an exe that runs on Windows, what is the best way to do it? I'm not sure that you can. You can use the same code on a Windows machine to compile for Windows, and then you can copy that code to a Linux machine and use the same code to compile to Linux. But I don't think you can cross-compile from directly from one operating system to another. But you'd have to check the Qt documentation or Stack Overflow for that. But I doubt that that can be done like that. You can use the same code, but not compile from one operating system to the other. Okay, then we're going to move on. Okay, I'm not going to go through this whole long list again. This is just a summary. Just for those who weren't here last week, I went through quite a lengthy introduction about the do's and don'ts and hints for exams. Please look at the recording for last week's class if you want to have a look at that detail. Okay, just some important stuff. Right, a tutorial letter 106, the so-called exam tutorial letter, has been uploaded to my Unisa, so please get hold of that. It's got all the rules and regulations and do's and don'ts about the exam in it. Then I've also put several links in the discussion forum on my Unisa in the exam topic. There's various webinars that are being presented by Unisa on online exams. There's also a link. There's two for IRIS, one to the actual IRIS site, which you need to go to and download IRIS. You must install IRIS, and it's a browser plugin. There's links for Edge and for Chrome. That link is in the exam discussion forum, but make sure that you've got IRIS installed prior to the exam. And if you go to that website and scroll down a bit, you will see information there about Mac OS and Linux and the like. But from what I gathered, there's no issue at all because IRIS is a browser plugin. It's not operating system dependent. But if you want more information about that, go to that link and read about it. And this part's very important. You must check that IRIS is working before the exam. There is a mock exam. You should all have a link in your My Modules, which is called IRIS Prep 2022. Please, once you've installed IRIS, go there and have a look at that mock exam and just make sure that your IRIS installation works properly and that you know how to work it. Then last week I mentioned this recommended book. I didn't give you the full name, but this is the full name. It's called Design Patterns, Elements of Reusable Object-Oriented Software, which was published in 1994. The authors are Gammerhelm, Johnson, and Lucides. They are known as the Gang of Four. When you see discussions on design patterns, and if you Google it, you'll often see references to the Gang of Four. They are the authors of this book. But if you want to know exactly how design patterns should be implemented and the correct way of doing it, this is more or less the only source. You will, if you Google and look at various websites and that, find slightly different interpretations of it. Some of that is language dependent because implementations in different languages are slightly different because of the constraints of the language. But the correct way of doing any design pattern is in this book by the Gang of Four. And then just some background to it. You'll notice that the book was published in 1994. So when you look at this book, just bear the following in mind. Back in 1994, which was sort of the middle ages of computing, UML wasn't a thing. There was no UML standard in 1994. Languages like Java, I think, was very much in its infancy. It was more a laboratory curiosity than an actual language back in 1994. C# was only implemented sometime after 1994. So just bear in mind that this book was written at a time when a lot of the stuff that we take for granted nowadays just didn't exist. And to me, that makes this book even more remarkable. That a book that was written basically in the dark ages of computing is still so relevant today and has had such a big impact on computing and software development. Just as a matter of interest, and I only found this out fairly recently, these guys were actually students when they wrote this book. They were studying PhD together. I've forgotten which university. So bear that in mind as well. When they wrote this book, they were actually PhD students. So in many ways, it's quite a remarkable book that's stood the test of time and had a very big influence on software development. Then getting back to the topic of basically why there are different ways to describe the same design pattern. If you have a look at this article on Stack Overflow or Google something along these lines, you'll find there's a very interesting discussion on why there are different ways to describe the same design patterns. And some of the things I put there about being language specific and about it being originally published all those years ago, and so on. And if you look at this book, you'll also find the authors actually specifically mention that these design patterns aren't meant to be rigid solutions. They are just, what's the word, almost suggestions or guidelines on how to solve a particular problem. They don't state that you must do it exactly like this and there's no other way to do it. It's more of a general guideline about how to approach the problem. So design patterns, shall I say, are reasonably versatile. They can be adapted and changed a bit to suit different requirements. And that is also then part of the reason why you find different interpretations and implementations if you look at different sources. But having said that, and without totally contradicting myself, we're living in an academic environment and we have less versatility. Please, you must stick to these sort of classic implementations as they are in this book and as described in your tutorial letter 105 and also the various videos on my Unisa. We don't have so much latitude here. So for academic purposes, you're going to have to need to do a fairly narrow interpretation, but out in the real world, you can basically break loose and do your own thing a bit more. Okay, question, Malala? Anna?
Hey, I'm questioning about the copying and interpretation. I don't know how you're supposed to put it in your interpretation, but still not copy when it's open book. I don't know how.
You cannot
how
copy something directly. You cannot copy and post. You can read the sources. You can look at it. You can be inspired by it. You can get direction and guidance from it. But at the end of the day, what you write down in your exam paper must be your own work. You cannot copy something directly from someone else and claim that that is your work.
No, I mean, you change this part and that part of the code isn't where, then how do you know whether I'm copying or not copying if I've changed just a little bit of the variables here and there? Or
Well, you're just going about it wrongly. Just drop the word copy, read it, get your ideas and thoughts, and then sit down and write your own code. Don't copy the code and then find ways to try and change it, because that's where you're going wrong.
okay.
You must do your own work. Don't copy something and then try and change it to make it look like it's yours, because that way you will get caught out for plagiarism. I say you can read something, you can get direction, you can get guidance, you can get inspiration. But what you put in your exam paper must be your own work and your own interpretation of it.
But then you said the implementation must look like a certain way, a certain structure.
Yeah,
That's
the
why I get confused.
structure of a design pattern, yes, must be the way it's in the prescribed book. But if you have to write code to implement parts of it, it must be your own code. You can't copy code from a website somewhere, put it in your exam paper and say, that's my work. So you have to follow the overall structure and the overall design, but the code you write and the answer you write must be your own. You can't just copy something from somewhere and change a word here or there. Okay, next question, Tabo.
So is copying code from my assignment counted as plagiarism?
If it's your own solution to assignment, no, then it's your own work. If you're copying the solutions that were provided to you by Unisa, then that's plagiarism. But if it's your own work and your own solution to assignment, you can basically do anything you like with it.
I was asking because in one of the assignments I used code that I used from my other assignment from course 2614, but when the assignment came back, the feedback said indicated that it was plagiarism.
Just remember, Dr. Pilkington will recognize his own assignment solutions. So just be careful about copying something from an old assignments. But I'll say again, if it's your own work and your own solution that you didn't just copy from somewhere and change a few words here and there, then that's okay. If it's your own solution, you can use it. But you can't use a solution that's been published elsewhere by somebody else.
So
Okay. Yes.
I'm still not clear there, because if you're using old assignment solutions and then you basically don't use the whole solution, but you try to follow its structure, it's difficult for me to see the difference between copying and following the structure. Maybe I'm not understanding that. And can
If
I
a
say
design,
some of the question papers I've worked out to figure out if I'm making a mistake or if I'm doing it wrong, so that I don't get caught out for plagiarism in the exam when I'm not trying to plagiarize?
if you get a UML diagram that has a specific structure in it, you have to follow that structure. But if you have to write code for any of the methods that are
I followed the
specified, then
UML
you have to write
diagram.
your own code. You can't copy the code from somewhere.
Hi, sir. I used with my assignment, I used book, the old solution for book for this year, and I was following the actual UML diagram. But I got flagged for plagiarism, and I did not understand where I went wrong, and it kind of stumbled me for the rest of the assignments, because I didn't know how not to copy.
Okay, if you want clarity, just email Dr. Pilkington and ask him to explain to you. He marked the assignment, so I can't answer that directly. But I'll say if it was an assignment that was sold by Stuvia, then that would have been picked up. If it was from one of Dr. Pilkington's old assignment solutions, he would have recognized it. So if you want clarification, just email him and ask him to explain. I can't give you a better answer than that. He will respond to you and he will answer your query. Okay, then moving on. And Dorda's question, can we access the recordings even if we're not part of the class? Yes, you can. You are part of the MS Teams group. You can access any of the recordings. but you have to sign into your MS, your Microsoft account, which is the same credentials as my Unisa. If you sign in as a guest, then you can't access the chat, and the recordings are in the chat. But you can access the recordings even if you didn't attend the meeting, as long as you logged into your Microsoft account. Okay, let's move on. All right, the scenario in this October-November 2021 paper. Okay, I'm not going to go through this laboriously like I did last week. I'm sure you can read the scenario all on your own. I'll just go through the general procedure. But basically, this scenario is about businesses needing to manage their communication. And there's various strategies that are mentioned, and you're given GUI to give you some more information about it. Just a bit of background about this exam paper. The strategy pattern in last year was specifically asked in the assignments, which is why it made up most of the exam. But as I said last week, the strategy pattern and the factory method are actually very similar. So this discussion won't be totally lost on you. And also remember, the one question in assignment 2 was really more about the strategy pattern than actually the factory method. And also remember that I did mention that the two are often used together, and there is a video on my Unisa that goes through an example with a combined strategy and factory method patterns, which is worth looking at. Okay, so you have to apply the strategy pattern to the scenario above, and that will also adhere to the following requirements. So you're given 3 basic strategies: a Signal, SMS, and WhatsApp. All is needed to create one of these is a type name. So you're looking at a factory type method there. Once an appropriate type has been created, a setup function would be used to populate object instance data members, and the communicate function would be used to process the required communication. Then you're given a communication strategy class diagram, which we'll see now, and it also says that you can abbreviate it to ComStrat instead of writing out their long name all the time. Sorry, just one thing. Question 1, you'll notice here is 15 marks. This paper, my thoughts were that the paper was a bit easy, and I actually told Dr. Pilkington that. And you notice this first question is only 15 marks. Now, there's a bit of a hidden pitfall in there. Last week, I spoke about drawing up, allocating your time and drawing up a schedule. If you've only got 15 marks for the first question, it means you don't have, based on a mark allocation, you don't have a huge amount of time for it. And you know, even if you get a fairly simple scenario, or a slightly easier one, it still takes you pretty much the same amount of time to read through it and extract all the classes and that. So if you get an opening question with a fairly low mark allocation, you must consider pinching a few minutes from some of the other questions and adding it into this first question, because it's essential that you read that scenario properly and get it clear in your mind what it is, because it will affect you through the rest of the exam. So just be careful if question 1 has got a low mark allocation. You might have to allocate a little disproportionate amount of time for it, because, as I said, it is essential that you get your strategy sorted. Okay, then we move over. Right, then you're given a very simple class diagram, which has a constructor and 2 methods and 3 data members. The first thing you should notice here is the italics for communication strategy and for the communicate method. So you know immediately that this is an abstract class and with a pure virtual method. So that's the first thing you should have picked up. And the question is, considering the scenario given in the design decisions listed above, draw a UML class diagram for the strategy pattern. Right, so you only have to draw a UML diagram only for the strategy pattern. So it's not an overall UML diagram. And then, as I emphasized last week, please read this part carefully. You should include the necessary classes, class attributes, class constructors and operations, and class relationship relationships to make it clear you understand how data will be managed and passed between classes. This is the important part. Understand how data will be managed and passed between classes. That is the part that we're looking for. But notice the difference with this one compared to the paper we went through last week. And this one, constructors are required, and also it mentions operations and relationships. But it's only the ones that allow you to understand how data will be managed and passed between classes. So don't rush into this and start doing all the getters and setters and a whole lot of irrelevant detail. You are specifically only asked to include constructors and then the methods and relationships that make it clear you understand how data will be managed and passed between classes. And then it also says label all relationships. And you do not have to include the client or GUI class. So don't waste your time putting in a client or GUI. So please, this part of your question, read it carefully and make sure you understand exactly what's required. And don't waste time putting in a whole lot of detail that's not actually required, and understand what the important part of the question is. And the important part is you have to understand how data will be managed and passed between classes. That's ultimately what you've got to illustrate, is the class relationships, and make it clear you understand how data will be managed and passed between the classes. So that's the important part of the question. Make sure you concentrate on that. And then just confirming again, you can use graphic software for your drawing your diagrams. And if you draw it by hand, please make sure you know beforehand how to convert it to PDF and include it in your exam submission. Don't try and work out during the exam how to make a copy of a handwritten UML diagram and include it with your submission. Make sure you know how to do that beforehand. Okay. I said I'm not going to go laboriously through the whole lot, but the first step is to identify the classes, relationships, methods, and data members. And again, I'm going to repeat my suggestion. I suggest you prepare a blank table, something like this with those headings beforehand. It'll save you a minute or two or three in the exam, and it will give you a starting point to sort of structure your answer properly. Obviously, you must develop a methodology that works for you. What I suggest is that you read through that scenario and extract the class names. Just make a list of the class names. That's the big thing. Once you've extracted the class names, you will then have a better idea of what's going on with that scenario. And once you've got the class names, you can then work out the relationships between this. In this one, we've got a very simple thing, a base class with 3 derived classes, and then the factory that has 2 relationships. And I would suggest at this stage that you draw a rough sketch on a piece of paper, because that will allow you to visualize the classes and the relationships that you're working with. And to me, that makes it a lot easier to proceed, because you've now got an idea of what it is you're looking at. You know, if you just try and carry on without being able to visualize it, you're probably going to get yourself a bit confused. You can then go through methodically and add in all the various methods and the properties that belong to each of the classes. And note all the derived classes have that abstract communicate method added to them, plus their constructor. You know, obviously you don't have to follow this exact methodology, but I really do suggest that whatever works for you, have it planned out and a clear idea in your head how you're going to approach a question like this during the exam. Don't leave it to the exam to try and figure out how you're going to do it, because you end up probably getting yourself confused. Go through past papers, get a bit of practice, work on a system that works for you, and then use that in the exam. But you must have a clear methodology in mind, otherwise you'd probably end up getting yourself very confused. But I say the important thing is identify the classes first, identify their relationships, make a rough sketch, and then you will have a visualization of how the whole scenario fits together, and it makes it much easier to proceed from there. But whatever you do, get some system ready. Don't leave it to the exam to try and work out. Okay, then once we've identified all the information that goes into our UML diagram, we start drawing it. The first thing is we put down the main class, the base class, which you were basically given anyway. So that's just copying what was there. So you were basically given this information, and notice the italics. Don't forget the abstract part. Just information, I don't know if it was mentioned specifically in this paper, but if you're drawing by hand, it usually says, instead of doing italics, you must underline them to indicate that it's abstract. Then the second step would then be to add the derived classes and show the relationship. In this paper, it is specifically mentioned, but I'd suggest you do it anyway, is write down what the relationship is, because there's always a possibility with your exam pressure and time constraints that you might end up putting the wrong arrowhead or something on. And if you actually write down specifically what the relationship is, you'd probably then still get your marks. But just make it explicitly clear that you understand what the relationship is between the classes. And once you've done that, the next step would then be to go in and add in the strategy factory part and its relationship. It uses the COMSTRAT and then creates the three derived classes in exactly the same way as the factory method works. In fact, if you look at that diagram, it is pretty much a factory method. So as I said before, the factory method and strategy design pattern are actually very closely related. It's only really the intent that differs. The intent of a strategy design pattern is to choose strategies at a runtime, different algorithms, whereas a factory method is, the intent is specifically to instantiate objects. But there's a distinction at times is not necessarily always very clear. So just be careful with those two. Okay, question. Please can you elaborate why there's a strategy factory? Hannah, because that's the way the strategy design pattern works. The strategy design pattern allows you to select different algorithms at runtime, and depending on which algorithm is selected, you need to instantiate objects of that type. And for instantiating objects, you use a factory so that your object instantiation is all grouped together in one place. And in this case, where they all have a common base class, they are in fact common products of the abstract base class. So the strategy factory, strategy design pattern and the factory method go hand in hand. They usually end up being used together. But yeah, there's a strategy factory because you have to instantiate objects of different strategies. Okay, and that is all you had to do for this scenario, for this exam paper. It's actually quite easy and straightforward. If you knew your strategy pattern, this was a bit of a giveaway. You should have been able to do it quite easily. I haven't seen the exam paper, so I don't know what's in it, but quite honestly, I doubt if you're going to be as lucky this year, as this paper was probably a little bit easy, so maybe you should be prepared for something a bit more challenging this year. Okay, moving on. Question 1.2, there were then some very simple questions. The provided UML class diagram included some of the text in italics. What does this indicate? 1 mark. Okay, yeah, there were 2 parts to it. The abstract, the italics part in the class name that denotes an abstract class. And for the method, it denotes that it's a pure virtual. It's also sometimes known as an abstract method. You should all obviously have known that. Describe what the function of the communicate function would be in this design pattern. Okay, this is where basically the application of knowledge bits come in. You won't find this anywhere or Google it or anything. You've got to be able to understand what is going on within this design pattern and the way it is set up. And so you need to be able to work out what the function of this communicate function is. And the answer is It's part of the base class, which is abstract. There's no implementation of it in the base class because it's a pure virtual method. And then in the derived classes, that communicate function implements the actual sending of messages on the appropriate platform. It depends on what type of strategy the object is, like an SMS or WhatsApp, for example. So anything along those lines that indicates that you have some understanding of what the purpose of that communicate function is. There's no necessarily absolute correct answer for that. As I say, it's just you need to indicate that you are able to understand and interpret what's going on. Then the next question sneaks in a bit of cloud computing. The decision has been taken to initially host this application using cloud computing. Would you recommend a public or private cloud model? And it's only 1 mark. Again, there's no real fixed answer here. You would need to just demonstrate that you do understand the issues involved. The answer to this would be a public cloud, and you can give any kind of reasoning for it, but it would be things like there's no capital expenditure, so it's a very low initial cost. It would be very rapid deployment, which could be scaled up at short notice if it required more capacity, and so on. So the answer would be public cloud, but then any kind of reasonable justification for that would do. Please don't neglect looking through that Microsoft Azure link that you've been given. You will likely get a question on it, but it's only likely to be sort of 1 or 2 or 3 marks. But it would be an easy bonus mark or 2, so don't neglect it completely. And question 2, right, this is a big part of the paper, 33 marks. It's not far off half the marks for the paper. Okay, this question relates to the code for creating and setting up of the required strategies. The setup function in the communicate strategy class is used to populate the data members in an instance object. This function does the following. First checks that the user code meets a particular pattern, so here's your regular expressions. If the user code does not meet requirements, the function returns false. If the user code does, the function returns true. Additionally, if the user code meets requirements, all data member values are populated. A signal created is emitted that sends the communication strategy type and the message separated by colon as a Q string. See the viewing window in figure 1, right? That was a GUI that you were provided at the beginning. So here's a little requirement for you to work out what's going on and write some code, and that also involves signals and slots and regular expressions and the like. Okay, and the actual question, write the code for the class definition. Notice this, the class definition, that's your header file for the communicate strategy class. That is what would be in the header file. Ensure that all functionality shown in figure 2 and that given above is included, and you get 7 marks for it. So it's relatively straightforward in that, but provided you can work out what's going on, you should be right. Again, I just want to point out that a question like this, there's no way on earth that you're going to be able to Google this or look it up in any source anywhere. You will not find this answer to a question like this anywhere. If you don't know how to do this, the open book part of the exam is not going to help you. So just make sure you do know and understand your work. Okay, the first thing, because it mentions signals and slots, you have to inherit QObject and include the QObject macro. Then you have the setup method, which includes the 3 parameters. And then you have to show that you, this communicate method, that you know how to make it abstract. In other words, it's virtual. And you add the equal 0 to make it into a pure virtual method. That's what makes your class abstract. You have to know how to implement a signal. Remember, a signal is always void. And in this case, it's used to pass some data. So you need to include the parameter and 3 data members you were given. So it's actually relatively straightforward. In fact, very straightforward. but you did need to pick up about the signals with Q object and so on. And then the other important part would have been this pure virtual method. Okay, I'm just looking at the questions. Leonard's question: how much of the exam is code written and how much is theory? Okay, the short answer to the question is I have absolutely and utterly no idea. What I'd suggest is have a look at these past papers and you'll get an idea of the proportions. As far as I know, the exam this year will be quite similar in structure to these ones. But off the top of my head, I'd say there's a lot more code-related stuff in the exam than there is theory. You will get very few questions that are pure theory that requires you to basically just regurgitate something that you've read somewhere. Most of the questions will be application of knowledge, like this question we're looking at now, where you have to be able to read the given information and then apply your knowledge and come up with an answer. So I'd say the bulk of the questions are one way or another going to be code related, either interpreting code or fixing code that you're given, which might have errors or omissions in it, or writing code directly. Because of the limited time in the exam, you won't get really lengthy code written examples. And where there are longer code examples, you will be given some of the code and you'll have to fill in the gaps. But I'd say that there's a lot more code-related questions where you either have to read and interpret code or write some code. Straight theory will be a relatively small part of the paper. Okay, Joel's question, so do we show virtual functions? No, virtual method or function is not in italics. In the diagram, it was given in italics. That indicates that it is pure virtual. But when you're writing the actual code, you have to know that you have to make it pure virtual by adding the equals 0. A UML diagram won't show the equals 0. It just shows that it's abstract or pure virtual. But to answer your question, no, virtual method is not abstract. It's a pure virtual method that's abstract. Okay, so this was a fairly easy question, as long as you knew about Q object and how to implement signals and a pure virtual method. Okay, question 2.2. Write a regular expression that can be used to check whether a string meets the following requirements. The first character should be G, K, or W. Second character could be any uppercase alphabetic character, and this should be followed by one or more lowercase alphabetic characters or digits. The final character should be the same as the first character. There's two different regular expressions that you could have used. You just make a group of GKW, and because there's no multiplier, it just means any one of those in there. Sorry, the spaces I'll just put here for legibility. You don't leave spaces. Again, in the range A to Z, there's no multiplier, so it's one uppercase character. And then you have lowercase characters or digit, and the plus sign indicates one or more of the items within the square brackets. Then last year's assignment had a question about a repeating group, but for those who don't know, a group is the part in the parenthesis in the round brackets, and if you put a backslash in a number, it repeats the group number. So the first group in this case is the GKW part. That would be repeated at the end. If that was /2, for example, then this A to Z group would be repeated. Okay, repeating groups is something you need to know about, but as I said last year, it was specifically asked in the assignment. But anyway, you do need to understand what a repeating group is. And just notice here that these regular expressions are not in the string. There's no inverted commas, so you don't need to escape the backslashes. If you write your answer in inverted commas to make it a string, you would need to escape the backslashes. Please don't forget that in the exam, Jack's question. So it would be wrong if we put escaping backslashes. No, Jack, it would be correct, provided you made it into a string and put it in inverted commas. So if you put inverted commas, you must escape the backslash. If there's no inverted commas, then it's not a string, and you don't need to escape them. So just be careful of that distinction. Okay, Joel's next question: how do I show a function that is virtual, not pure virtual? You just put the word virtual in front of it. It's only if you add the equals 0 at the end that it becomes pure virtual. But a virtual function just has the keyword virtual in front of it. Okay, so that was fairly straightforward regular expressions. Again, if you knew how to use regular expressions, that shouldn't have been much of a problem. But for those of you who didn't know how to use regular expressions, I doubt whether looking it up would have helped you answer the question. The only thing that might have helped you is if you basically knew how to use regular expressions, but you weren't sure about one or two of the meta characters, you could look that up. But I assure you, you're not going to magically learn how to use a regular expression in the exam through an open book exam. You do need to know how to use regular expressions, and the open book part will only help you with the finer points of your answer, or to confirm which meta characters to use or something like that. So please don't make that mistake, as I spoke about last week, of thinking open book is easy and that you can just look stuff up. Besides the fact that you probably won't actually find much of the stuff, you'll waste too much time and you won't finish the paper. But anyway, a fairly straightforward question. In 2.3, write the code for Boole communication strategy setup. Write the setup method. Use the information you have so far in this question to guide you, where the regular expression 2.2 will be used to check the user code. Note the structure of the signal sent out. It's a strategy with a colon and then the actual method. Without using a data member within the class, the type of strategy or class should be indicated before the colon. Okay, you should know already, therefore, that you're going to have to use a meta object to determine that information. Before I go there, I see Jack's got a follow-up question. I added the dollar to the end of my answer. Do we not need that? Jack, it's debatable. It's probably not absolutely required, but it's certainly not incorrect if you do add it. It's pretty much optional. I don't think that's initially the level of detail you need to look at unless it's unless the question specifies that it must be a standalone string and not a substring. But yeah, you can put it if you want to, but it's probably not essential. I'm pretty sure you'd be correct either way. Okay, so the setup method. Basically, you need to know how to set up a regular expression and the regular expression match. Then you just have a simple if statement where you extract the user code and the information, and particularly the message that's required. And then you extract the class name using the meta object and its class name method. Remember, you can call meta object on any Q object, and this class is a Q object. That's why it's using the this pointer there. I'm pretty sure it would work without the this pointer there as well. But anyway, you need to extract the class name or the strategy name using the class name method of meta object. So there you get the strategy, and then the message string was passed into the method. Then you just have to emit that signal that was declared previously, and you just construct a simple thing with a strategy with a colon separator, and then the message. And just remember that strategy is actually the class name of those derived classes. And then you return true. Remember, that's within the if statement, provided your regular expression was matched correctly. Notice here it is in inverted commas, and therefore the backslash is escaped because now it is actually a string. So just again emphasize that distinction. And then you return false if it didn't match. So again, a fairly straightforward question on defining and matching a regular expression, and then knowing how to concatenate or how to extract the class name using meta object and concatenate a string message together with the class name, and then emitting a signal, passing data by means of a signal. Once again, I want to emphasize the obvious. There's no amount of looking anything up anywhere or Googling will find the answer to this question. You either know how to write the code and implement regular expressions and emit signals, or you don't. But trying to look this up in sources would just waste your time and you won't find it anyway. So please do make sure you understand your work and that you know how to define and implement regular expressions, and that you know how to define and emit signals. Again, if you knew your work, this question is actually quite straightforward. Okay, another question, Jack. Okay, Jack, the question is the correct way to declare the regex in the function or as a member of the class. You make it a member of the class if it needs to be persistent, or if you need to call it from different methods. If you're only going to use it once just to validate a specific string in one place, then you can declare it within the method. So it depends on the circumstances. If it's just a single use, locally declare it in the method. If there's some reason why you need to access it from more than one place, or need to be persistent, then declare it as a class member. In this example, it was just used once to validate the input into this method, so it could be done locally. It's quite sufficient for this answer. But yeah, the real answer is it depends on the circumstances. You're just going to have to work that out on the day. Okay, sorry, I'm just reading the question. You mentioned Googling. Okay, George's question. I went through this in detail last week. Please look at the recording, and I've also posted it in the discussion forum on my Unisa and the exam topic. All the information is there. Please have a look at that. Basically, you can look at anything, but just make sure what you submit is your own work. Don't copy anything from anywhere and submit it as your own work. You can read stuff, you can interpret it, you can be inspired by it, but you must write your own answer and submit your own work. Don't copy anything from anywhere. But have a look at the discussion forum on my Unisa. I've posted all the information there, and also look at the recording for last week. I went through it in considerable detail. Okay, question 2.4. The signal that is emitted by setup is picked up by the GUI client code and used to populate the viewing window in figure 1. So just note everything refers back to that scenario in the GUI diagram, a screenshot that you were given at the beginning. So please just make sure you understand and know what's going on in that scenario, and then any screenshots in that you're given, because everything through the paper keeps on referring back to that. What various widgets could be used to hold this information, explaining what need to be in place to make such use possible. 6 marks. Okay, the answer, again, there's different answers you can give here as long as you show your understanding of it, but you could have used a Q-text edit or a Q-plain text edit. They can be used directly. Just note that you couldn't use a Q-line edit. Then you can use a Q-list widget. And I've just made a note there, or other convenience widget. It doesn't have to be a list. And you need to note that it's a convenience class and that the model and view are combined. So the question is just looking for your understanding here, that you know what the implications of using the different types of widgets are. And you could have used a table view. Again, you could have used another view like a tree view or a list view. And you just need to be aware that it requires a suitable model, something like a Q standard item model, to be linked to the view. So there's different types of widgets that could be used. You just need to indicate your understanding of what the implications or limitations are of using the different types of widgets that are available. So again, this question is looking for your, basically your understanding and insight. And if you don't know about these different types of widgets or understand how they're used, you would struggle to answer a question like this. Okay, sorry, I'm just reading questions again. Dr. P sent out assignment and you've used that to adjust your assignment code. There's no longer your work and be plagiarism. Yes, Josh, your question, you cannot use directly Dr. Pilkington solutions to assignments. You can use your own solutions, or you can look at those provided solutions to get the correct sort of methodology and method to solve a problem. But any code that you write from that must be your own code. You can't just copy the code from those solutions. And I assure you, Dr. Pilkington will recognize his own solutions. Okay, moving on, question 2.5. The signal that is emitted by setup could be seen as an implementation of which design pattern? Explain why you say so. Note the important part, explain. Again, the question is looking for your understanding and insight, not just for you to put one-word answers. And for this, you needed to remember your work from COS3611. The answer is the observer pattern. And the answer, again, is not a fixed answer. You just have to indicate that you understand what the issue is with observers, observer pattern, and signals and slots. And anything along these lines would be sufficient. QT signals and slots is an implementation of the observer pattern. So that's an important thing that you have to know. This construct object is the observed object that notifies when something happens. And then the other connected objects are the observers that react or respond to the signal emitted by setup. So you need to know about observed objects and observers and how they connect together with signals and slots. And you need to know that signals and slots is an implementation of the observer pattern. I say the important thing here was that you need to know that signals and slots is QT's implementation of the observer pattern. And then you have to give some indication that you understand how the observer pattern works. But for the second 2 points, there's no real fixed answer. It's just indicating that you do have some understanding of what's going on. And question 2.6. Based on the communication strategy class settlement 2.1, would the following code be legal? Explain why or why not. Note that marks are allocated only for the reason given. Again, I'll keep emphasizing this. You need to show that you understand what's going on. You need to be able to explain things. It's no good just putting down 1 or 2 words. You won't get marks for that. You must indicate your understanding. You must be able to explain why things are so. Then you're given some information here. Assume CS is a pointer to some valid communication strategy object. And then you get this code, CS set property with a name and value pair. And the answer is yes, it is legal. And the reasons it's legal is because constraint inherits Q object. Remember, it's essential for properties that your classes inherit Q object. And in fact, what should have been mentioned here as well, that it implements the Q object macro. And then you needed to explain basically that although there's no fixed properties defined, that code would actually set a dynamic or variable property named priority. So again, it's just testing understanding of the difference between fixed and dynamic properties and your awareness that you don't, in fact, have to formally define fixed properties in a class and able to be able to use reflection. You can call a set property method on anything that's a Q object and use dynamic properties. So again, this question is really testing your understanding of reflection and how it's implemented in Qt. And question 32, question 3, 32 marks, jumping ahead. Okay, again, big mark allocation here, so this is clearly an important question. The question relates to the writing of the data in the viewing window to an XML file. Assume that the data in the viewing window can be stored in a string list for use in the writing to XML process, where each line consists of the string of characters as seen in the viewing window in figure 1. Again, stating the obvious, everything relates back to the scenario and the screenshot you were given at the beginning, so it's important that you understand that and how it works. This list must be passed to an object instance of a class that should be run as a thread. Right, so here we are combining threading and XML. Then you're given a basic XML file structure, which has a root element and then some, or in fact, only one element type of communication, and which has different attributes depending on the class type. So let's have a look at that. Question 3.1. The following code has been provided for the class header file. However, this is not considered good practice. Change the code so it meets what is considered good practice and will support being run and it's due as a thread. Right, so this is testing your ability to be able to implement a thread. You will notice that this is incorrect. We don't do threading by inheriting from QThread. That's an outdated, obsolete method. So it's just a complete incorrect approach. You need to use the move to thread method. So you need to change this code so it needs to meet what is considered good practice, and that's using move to thread. So it's only 3 marks, so it's no big deal. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay. Again, you need to inherit QObject and include the QObject macro, because you need to implement a signal and finished. Remember, your worker class, to set up your threads properly, it needs to emit a finished signal so that you can handle the quitting of the thread and the deleting of pointers and the like. So if your worker class doesn't have a finished signal or something similar in it that will indicate when a thread is finished running, you need to implement it. So you need to inherit QObject, and the other stuff is just basic. Then you need a slot that does the actual work that gets called when the thread starts, and the rest is just basic normal class with a constructor and a data member. But yeah, the important parts here was the QObject inheritance and implementing the signal. The rest of it you were pretty much given. So again, if you know how to implement Q threads and move to threads and workers and the like, very simple and straightforward question. Question 3.2, assuming that the string list passed to the right XML has been saved to a variable named string list in the class constructor, write the code for the do-write function so that each line in the string list is written to file in the format above using DOM. A portion of the code is given below and you have to add the missing parts. To go back to that question that was asked earlier about a code versus theory, right? This is a typical kind of question where you have to write code. As I said, because you have limited time in the exam, you won't get questions that require you to write huge amounts of code. You will invariably be given a basic structure like this, and you will have to fill in the missing bits. And this is the part you're given as a DOM document. You have to fill in all the rest of the DOM structure. So let's look at that. Okay, the parts that are in bold are the parts that you have to add in. Right, you declare your DOM document you were given. You then have to declare DOM element, your root method, and you give it a name which you were given in the sample XML called communications. In the normal way, you append that root element that you just created to its parent, which is the document. And we then carry on into, you had to declare the string list items. And then remember that was passed to the, wait, sorry, I'm getting myself confused here. Assuming the string list passed to has been saved to string list in the class constructor. Okay, I'm getting myself confused here. Okay, I'm not sure this code that I've given you is entirely correct, because if this string list was passed to the constructor, you wouldn't have to declare it again here. So I suspect that line is actually not required. Right, in the list, you then need to split the given string. Oh, wait, sorry, okay. Right, let me start again. Okay, what is passed to the constructor is a, wait. Right, you've got a data member called string list, and that string list gets passed into it. And you create a new string list. Oh, okay, yeah. You're looping through the string list that was passed to your constructor when you instantiated this object, and you are looping through and extracting each string from it. You then use the string list that you've just instantiated, and you extract from the individual string, and you split it based on that colon that joined the two separate items. Remember, you were given that structure that you had to emit in the signal, where you joined concatenated two items with a colon. So you split each string, and you get a string list then that has two items in it. Right, now we're getting where. I'm sorry for the confusion. Yes, it is time. I'm due a coffee break. It's difficult concentrating for going on 2 hours. Okay, so we've now looped through that string list that was passed in, and we've got each string that was in the string list that was passed in, and we've then split the string list on the colon that joins the two parts, and now we have another string list that's got actually two individual items in it. Right, we then declare another DOM element named communication. Right, that's the child elements that's within our root element. We set the attribute, which was named a channel, if you look back at the XML code, and then we basically extract the first item in the string list that we've just created. And then in the normal DOM fashion, we append this child to our root. We then create another DOM element, which is the actual message part. And the message has a DOM text. That's the part between the start and end tags. We create this text node, and we extract then the second item in the string list that we just created by splitting the input string. And we append that text into our message element, and we append the message element to the communication element, because this is a child of that. And then we loop through, and we do that for each one, right? It's just normal DOM construction of a DOM document. And then most of the file writing is given, but you had to add in this part about the text stream create a text stream, and then output your DOM document, convert it to string, and output it to the text stream that you created on the file. And then the important part at the end, you emit the finished signal so that the thread can be closed down appropriately at the end. Other than a bit of confusion I had, it's reasonably, or in fact, it's totally normal DOM document processing that follows the normal process of creating an element and appending it to its parent, and then creating an element, creating the text part of it, and then appending both of those to their appropriate parent. And then just remembering this end bit about how to actually write all the data to the file, and that's an important part about emitting this finished signal. It's quite an important part of the processing. Okay, write the code that would be included in the GR client code that would run in the instance of this class as a thread. So it's quite a big question here about threading and DOM processing. There's no output that needs to be handled as the output is written in the file. Assume that no object instances have been created. It's only 6 marks for doing your threading. Guys, I know over the years, students for some reason have tended to struggle a bit with doing threads. You shouldn't really, because the procedure is exactly the same every time. Those of you who haven't had a look yet, I should have put the link here, but that article by Maya Posh that I mentioned previously, there is a link in the exercises. This just follows exactly the same procedure, and it's invariably always the same. You instantiate your thread and worker objects. In this case, we were given the right XML as a worker. You declare thread, new key thread, and just be careful, it's very big pitfall here. You do not declare your threads inside a method, because threads invariably take longer than the method to process. And if your method returns while the thread is still running, your thread pointer will be destroyed and you will have an almighty crash. So don't declare threads within slots. You must declare them globally. I'm just doing this here for illustration, but this declaration should be outside the slot. So you've declared your worker, you declared your thread. You then move your worker to the thread by calling the move to thread method, which you can call on any queue object. You then connect the signals and slots, right? You connect the thread's started signal to the appropriate slot in your worker, which you know was called do right. Okay, so once the thread starts, it will emit the started signal, and that will call the slot in your worker that will run, start the worker running. Then you need to tidy up. You connect your worker's finished signal to the thread's quit slot. In other words, you tell the slot to quit once the worker's finished doing its thing. You then connect the worker's finished signal to the worker's own delete later slot, and that delete later will handle all the deletion of pointers, so you don't have to worry about that in your destructor or anything. And then you note the thread's finished signal, which will get emitted when it gets that slot, and you connect that to the thread's delete later slot, and that will handle the deletion of all the pointers. So declaring a finished signal in the worker is very important, because that is how you get the slot to quit, and it's how you get to call the delete later slot, which handles the deletion of pointers. So it's a very important part of the functionality. And then the last thing you do is call the start method on the thread. When you call start, the thread will then emit the started signal, and that will call the do right slot in the worker, which will get the worker running. But that's the way that process for connecting or starting threads is always the same. You declare the worker, you declare the thread. You move the worker to the thread, you connect all the signals and slots. It's basically always the same ones, the started, the finished, and the delete later and so on, and then you start the thread. That basic procedure is always the same when you're handling threaders. Declare worker and thread, move the worker to the thread, connect the signals and slots, make sure you understand which signals and slots have to be connected and which one's in the thread and which one's in the worker, and then you call the start method on the thread. That should be relatively easy marks, as that basic procedure is always the same. Then this part asks about what I already mentioned. When running the code that had been set up by novice, the IDE gave the message Q thread destroyed while thread's still running, and no data was written to file. Explain what the problem could be and how to solve it. Again, here you need to understand sort of how threads work and also to an extent how C++ works. And the answer was what I just mentioned. The thread was declared with a local scope, in other words, within the method, and it gets destroyed when the method returns before the thread has finished or being destroyed. And you will invariably get a big crash when that happens. So the solution then is to declare the thread objects as class members, global scope within a class, but generally outside the slot. Don't declare it inside the slot because it'll get destroyed when the slot returns. Then you implement the worker finish signal to be emitted when the worker task is completed and connect that to the thread's quit slot. In other words, so the thread will only be stopped or quit once the worker is actually finished doing what it's supposed to do. Just remember, when you use threading, it's often fairly complicated things that can have a relatively long processing time. And if you try and do this all within the slot, your slot will invariably return before the thread is finished running, and you will get these crashes. You only want your thread to stop once the worker tells it that it's actually finished. So the last thing the worker should do is emit its finish signal, and that's then connected to the thread's quit slot, so that the thread will only quit once the worker is actually finished. And then you connect both the worker and the thread's finish signals to their respective delete later slots. So both of their sets of pointers get deleted after they've both completed their work. And that is the correct way to handle threading. But the important thing is, remember, don't declare your thread within a slot. Otherwise, it will invariably get destroyed before the thread is finished running. Okay, sorry, I'm just looking at the questions. Percival's comment. Leonard, if Ron is confused, how will we be during the exam? Leonard, you'll be ready because you don't have to talk for 2 hours on end, concentrating all the time and trying to read messages and think ahead and read what you're actually reading it all at the same time. Just concentrate on one thing at a time and you'll be fine. Percival's question, I think your object macro should be included regardless for Q objects. Yes, that's a very valid comment. You will in fact see that kind of suggestion posted quite often in places like Stack Overflow. Even although you might not absolutely necessarily require the Q object macro, it is a good idea to always include it for any Q object derived class. Then Joshua's comment, yes, that's linked to Maya Posh's article. Anyone who hasn't looked at that article, please have a look at it. It explains very clearly how the correct way to implement threads by using the thread move to thread method. Brink's question, is move to thread a Q object method? Yes, it is indeed a method of Q object. Okay, let's move on. We're actually right at the end. Question 3.5. Suppose that this XML file were to be read into another application. One developer noted that as DOM was used to write the file, DOM will have to be used to pass it again. Comment on the statement, 2 bonus marks. And the answer is no, it's not necessary. You can use SAX or DOM or QXML stream reader. And the answer is basically that XML is a standard specification and can be passed by any method. It doesn't matter how it was prepared, or even if you wrote the XML file manually, you can still use any of the methods to read it. So it's a standard. It's the structure of an XML file. It doesn't matter how it was created. And that, in a nutshell, is the October-November 2021 past paper. Hopefully you agree that it's relatively easy and learn that there's no need at all to freak out. If you keep your cool and you're well prepared and you spend a few minutes at the beginning of the paper reading it carefully and getting that scenario clear in your head, extract the classes, make a sketch and work from there, you should be fine. Don't waste time looking things up. Jack's question, can we go through October, November exam next week? No, Jack, you'd have to repeat the module next year in order to go through the October, November exam again. Tristan, how will exams differ this year since this was a year module instead of a semester module? Tristan, no difference at all, other than you've had basically 6 extra months to prepare for it. And Akira's question, feeling a little bit less dumb. Yes, I think all of you, or I hope all of you are feeling less dumb. As I say, guys, the COS3711 exam is actually not that difficult. If you're reasonably well prepared, you should be able to sail through it. The biggest issue is generally time. Students waste time and then don't finish the paper. Please allocate your time carefully and don't spend too much time on any question. If you're running over, move on to the next question. And if you've got time left, come back to it. But manage your time. That's the most important thing. Brings question, SAX cannot be used to write XML. Correct, SAX is reading only, whereas DOM can be used to read, write, and edit. SAX is read only. Okay, guys, that's basically all I have. As I said, class next week, Wednesday, same time, Dr. Pilkington will be presenting that. So if you've got any outstanding questions, please ask him, and just remind him also about setting up Iris. And please, somebody who attends one of the webinars, just please see if you can get clarification about uploading pictures and what to do in the event of load shedding, etc. And post it on my Unisa. I'm sure it would be a great help to many students. Okay, guys, that's it. Good luck for the exams. If you've been following these classes and doing exercises and things, I think you should be fine. So don't worry too much about the exam. Okay, guys, thank you.